You're welcome to His Gov TV. My name is Colin Nanaya Abebese. Now, in this video, we are going to look at the reasons for the partition of Africa by the Europeans. And so let's take a look at our lesson objectives for today. Now we have two words there, scramble for and also partition. So the scramble led to the partition. And I believe that when you are asked to define the meaning of scramble, you will be able to, of course, define, or you understand for what we mean by scramble. When you scramble for something, then later it then ended up in a partition. So Africa was scrambled for. And then later, that scramble ended up in a partitioning. And you also understand partitioning, to divide or demarcate, or to divide. So it's like you are in the house with your kids and you are scrambled over an orange, and therefore your mom decides to partition or take the orange and partition or divide the oranges and give each and every one to all of you so that you do not fight. That is what the partition of Africa is all about. So, when you look at the map on your screen, you realize that the geographical area of Africa had no boundaries, had no partitions. Now, most of the civilizations you found in the Asante, the Dahomey, the Swahili, of course, ancient Egypt, all these, of course, civilizations or group of people were on the African continent, and these people could move from, of course, one place to the other without any form of restrictions. Okay, so most of the civilizations in Africa were independent. They were independent countries. They were independent states. But then a different story. Of course, a different story had to be told somewhere in 30 years later. Now, the partition took place, of course, somewhere between 1880, thereabout. By 1930, after 30 years later, by 1930, a different story had to be told. Now, what is this different story that we are talking about? With the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia, all the states and kingdoms that I mentioned had been shared among European powers. These powers included Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, as well as Belgium. These are European countries scrambled for territories in Africa. They wanted the land of Africa. Now, let's take a look at some examples of such scrambled. For example, in 1882, the British and the French scrambled over Egypt. So both the French and the British needed Egypt, basically because of the Suez Canal. And bear also in mind that these two European countries, France and Britain, were the most country that scrambled for most of that. So the scramble was intense among these people. Now let's move on. Portugal and Britain again scrambled over East Africa. All right, and these scramble for, of course, territories nearly ended up in war, because when you are scrambling, you and your brother is scrambled for something, it may lead to war, and it nearly led to war. So in order for them to resolve the issue, of course, so that there won't be any war, Otto von Bismarck, the German, of course, chancellor at that time, organized a conference. But we will look at the conference later to make sure that all these European powers come together to actually resolve the issue. So as I said earlier, the rivalry between the French and the Britain over African territories was the most intense among all the European powers. And so it is not surprising that most of the African countries today have, of course, the French or the British as their colonial master. So the question then is, why was Africa scrambled for, which later led to its partitioning? Don't forget, after the partitioning, then we came to have the boundaries we have today. So for instance, Ghana, we have a boundary around Ghana. Beside Ghana, we have a boundary, Togo. Beside Togo, we have another country, and all these, of course, countries were demarcated, lines were drawn. And these lines were drawn not by Africans, but by the Europeans themselves. So the French will say, this area up to that area belongs to me. So, of course, the French would demarcate a line, which then suggests that any other person who is not within that jurisdiction of the French territory was not allowed to go in there. You may need a form of permission. Meanwhile, the land was one. The land was the same. There was no river, of course, separating any of them. But because the French or the British have demarcated the line that this area belongs to me, you do not cross and go into that territory. And that led to the partition that today you find so many countries in Africa. Let's look at the reasons for the partition of Africa. Now, the reasons for the partition of Africa can be found in three general ways. We have the economic reasons, we have the social reasons, then we also have the political reasons. I'll share with you some of these reasons. So let's begin with the economic reasons. Now, one of the economic reasons was that the Europeans wanted to find surplus market for their surplus produce. Surplus market for their surplus produce. So, as noted, an economic motive of the partition of Africa was the Industrial Revolution. At the heart of this whole economic motive, why the Europeans decided to scramble for and partition of Africa was because of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, somewhere in the second half of the 19th century. Now, what was this Industrial Revolution about? The Industrial Revolution was a period, when the use of complicated machines came to replace the use of human hands. And also, of course, simple tools in the production of goods and the rendering of services. So now, man was no more using their hands or simple tools to produce and to offer or render, of course, services. This was the period when industries, machines had now been invented. So now, these are European countries, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, Italy, they all became industrialized. They all had industries. Now, when you have these industries, what it means is that if before the Industrial Revolution, you were producing, say, a car with human hands, how many can you produce? I don't think you can produce many. So, of course, for instance, if you could produce, say, 1 car or 3 cars in a week with human hands, now that you have machines to do that work for you, it means that you will be able to produce more cars in that week than when you were using your hand. So a problem arose in these European countries who were industrialized, that production far outstripped the demands of the internal market in these European countries. And so these European countries found, or they needed a new market to absorb this excess supply of manufactured goods. And therefore, they decided to look for colonies, areas where they could dominate, and then send these surplus produce to. And so that was the reason. So France, Britain, all of them needed another market to sell their surplus produce. Because at this point in time, Europe was not that many. The population was quite few. And so they needed that. Now, the next of the economic reason for the scramble for end partition of Africa was that the Europeans needed raw materials to feed their local industries. And as I have earlier indicated, the Industrial Revolution once again. Now, Europeans needed raw materials to feed their industries. They needed, of course, raw materials such as gold, ivory, rubber, timber, palm oil, etc., etc., to manufacture their goods. Now, gold, for instance, was used in the minting of coins and jewelries and all of that. Of course, rubber were also used to manufacture ties, that's car ties, whereas ivory were also used for musical instruments. Timber and others were also used for home, of course, furniture and papers. Now, the demand for these raw materials became very acute and competitive, because bear in mind that these are raw materials that these industries need in order to produce these items were not found in Europe. Hence, these European countries needed a colony, or a source where they could get these items. And Africa was rich in gold, rubber, the Congo, Ivory Coast. Most of the African countries were rich in all these. So they were all scrambling for source of these raw materials so that they can feed their industries with it. And that brought with it that colonial economic, system, whereby African countries were forced by their colonial masters to plant or to grow or cultivate a particular type of food crop or raw materials, so that the colonizers, could come and buy them at a cheaper price, go and manufacture the item in the in Europe, and then return it back at a very exorbitant prices to the colonies to buy. Good. Now, the next economic reason was that the Europeans also needed a place to invest their surplus capital. Now, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, of course, once again had generated huge profit for these industrialists. So if you had a company, you could now produce more. So there was a lot of profit in there for you. And therefore, as a businessman or a businessman, you may want to reinvest the profit that you have gained in other areas. So agencies of the chartered company like the Royal, of course, Niger Company, Imperial East African Company, the South African Chartered Company, were all used for this purpose. They formed for companies to dominate these areas. Good. This was the economic reasons for the partition. Let's take a look at the social reasons for the partition. Now, one of the social, reasons for the partition of Africa was also that the Europeans wanted to spread our Christian faith to the African, which to me, I don't believe would be a scramble, even though it could be a reason for their coming. But to say scramble, just to introduce the word of God and they will scramble for, I believe it's just some way. But the Europeans felt that it was the white man's burden to actually help educate and civilize the less, in quotes, fortunate people elsewhere in their estimation in Africa. But I think that was a wrong notion about Africa. Africans were very, very civilized before the Europeans came. We were not backward. We were not unfortunate people. We were civilized. Our civilization, I would say, was even superior to their civilization. or the Western civilization. You understand? Today, they claim that it is a white man's burden, or they claim then it was a white man's burden to civilize and educate us. That is through the Christian faith, through their schooling system. But if you look at the customs and the values they are introducing to Africans today, are not Christian values. You understand? So that was also a reason to Christianize the African. And the Christianization came with it, the Europeanization of Africans. But that will be a different day. Now the next one was also, the Europeans also needed a place to settle their excess population to ease unemployment. This was another reason for the partition. Europe's population was more, especially Italy, and Italy was a small state. So they needed a place to settle these people. And don't forget, the Industrial Revolution also came with it. Job losses, where a chunk of the people were rendered redundant. They had no job to do. So that accounted for the reason why some of the Europeans came to settle in the eastern part of Africa and in South Africa and but then in West Africa, because of the nature of the climate, very hot, mosquito-like weather, rainforest with mosquitoes and heat. So they found that place unattractive, so they did not, of course, came to settle, but only to trade in that area. So excess of population for settlement to ease employment in Europe was also a reason for the partition of Africa. The next one had to do with the political reasons for the partition of Africa. Another political, the first political reason for the partition of Africa was also the notion that in those days, there was a balance of power in Europe after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878. And so when that balance of power happened, European countries could not extend their territories in Europe. Okay, and at this point, the more colonies a country had, the more powerful that country was seen to be. And so in order to show, for instance, France, because France lost a lot of colonies in Europe, in order to show that she was still, powerful, she then came to Africa. And that explains how come France has more colonies than any other European country. Good. So I think you have learned something from our discussions today. If I asked you a question like, name any 6 European countries involved in the scramble for Africa, I hope you'll be able to do that, and also discuss the reasons for the scramble for end of partition of Africa. Thank you for your time. Don't forget to share your view in the comment section.